The summer of 1941 dawned on a Europe largely conquered by Nazi Germany. From the Pyrenees to the Polish border, the swastika flew over captive nations, and in Berlin the mood was triumphant, victorious, and utterly confident. At his heavily fortified Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was preparing his masterstroke, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. To his inner circle of generals and sycophants, he described the Soviet state in contemptuous terms. A rotten structure that needs only one good kick to come crashing down. This was more than military strategy, it was ideological certainty. Hitler genuinely believed the Slavic people were subhuman, incapable of organized resistance, and that Stalin's purges had left the Red Army leaderless and demoralized. The plan was brutally simple. A swift, violent campaign of annihilation, over before the winter could set in. 3 million men, the finest army Germany had ever fielded, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, stood ready to deliver that single decisive kick that would, in Hitler's view, secure German domination of Europe for 1,000 years. But in that same headquarters, amidst the confidence and meticulous planning, one man saw a different future unfolding. A future of catastrophe and ruin. General Gotthard Heinrici was not a typical Prussian aristocrat. He was a meticulous, careful soldier, a master of defensive warfare who believed in facts above all else, and the facts accumulating on his desk were deeply, fundamentally disturbing. While official German intelligence estimates placed Soviet strength at approximately 200 divisions, Heinrici's own painstaking analysis, compiled from frontline reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and prisoner interrogations, suggested the true number was far greater, likely approaching 300 divisions. There were persistent, fragmented reports of massive Soviet formations held deep in reserve, far from the immediate border areas, strategic assets that German planning had completely ignored. Even more alarming were the scattered but consistent accounts from various sources describing new Soviet tanks, specifically the T-34 and the heavy KV-1, whose revolutionary sloped armor and powerful main guns made them seemingly impervious to the standard German 37mm anti-tank guns that equipped the infantry divisions. Heinrici spent long, sleepless nights studying his maps, but not, like his colleagues, to trace ideal attack routes. Instead, he calculated the vast, empty distances of Western Russia, the primitive and sparse road network that would inevitably become an impassable quagmire during the autumn rains, and the brutal, unforgiving winter that Napoleon's Grande Armée had failed to survive a century earlier. He saw a strategic nightmare unfolding, a terrifying abyss of space and time that would inevitably swallow German supply lines and stretch his fighting divisions to their absolute breaking point. The official intelligence, he concluded with growing horror, was not just slightly inaccurate, it was dangerously, catastrophically delusional, based more on racial wishful thinking and political prejudice than on the hard, mathematical reality of men, machines, logistics, and geography. The ghost of 1812 was no mere historical curiosity to Heinrici. It was a palpable presence, a warning from history that was being systematically ignored. Driven by a profound sense of professional duty and a growing, chilling sense of alarm for the men he commanded, Heinrici knew he had to act. He sought a private audience with General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant, ambitious, and notoriously demanding commander of the Panzer armies, the very spearhead of the planned invasion. Their meeting was tense and sober. Guderian, the primary architect of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, was naturally confident in the raw shock power and speed of his tank divisions, but even he privately shared concerns about the immense logistical challenges and the unknown, frightening depth of Soviet strategic reserves. Heinrici laid out his evidence with grim precision and unwavering logic. He spoke of the severely underestimated division count, the qualitatively superior enemy tanks now rolling out of Soviet factories, and the sheer overwhelming vastness of the terrain they were about to enter. Then he used the powerful metaphor that would come to haunt the entire campaign. "We are not carefully hunting a deer in a managed forest, Heinz," Heinrici said, his voice low, serious, and laden with foreboding. We are foolishly poking a massive, dormant bear in its own deep, dark den, and we have absolutely no true concept of how immense that bear truly is, how razor-sharp its claws have become, or how ferociously and relentlessly it will fight to protect its home and its young. The image was stark, visceral, and unforgettable. Both seasoned commanders understood the immense stakes. With heavy hearts, they agreed that the Führer had to be confronted with this uncomfortable truth before the irreversible order was given and the wheels of destruction were set in motion. The stage was now set for a climactic confrontation that would echo through history. In the stark, brightly lit map room of the Wolf's Lair, under the glare of electric lights reflecting off the polished table, Hitler stood before his grandiose operational plans, the thick, confident arrows of invasion thrusting deep into the Soviet heartland toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. He spoke with fiery conviction of a swift, glorious victory, the final culmination of his political vision. The assembled generals, with Keitel and Jodl at the forefront, nodded in sycophantic agreement, their faces masks of approval. Then Heinrici stepped forward. He carried his thick file of evidence, a heavy dossier of cold, hard, verifiable facts that stood in direct, unyielding opposition to the Führer's fanatical, ideologically driven vision. In that electrically charged moment, the fate of 3 million men, the future of the German nation, and the course of the World War hung in a delicate, precarious balance. The warning, born of meticulous professional analysis and grim, unshakable foresight, was about to be delivered directly to the one man who had the sole power to stop the looming catastrophe. But in a regime built on unquestioning loyalty and ideological purity, would reason be heard, or would pride and dogma seal a terrible fate? The air inside the Wolf's Lair map room was thick with palpable tension, a mixture of anticipation, ambition, and the distinct smell of polished leather and boot oil. Adolf Hitler had just concluded his operational briefing, his eyes blazing with messianic conviction as he vividly described the imminent and total collapse of the Judeo-Bolshevik Soviet state. The atmosphere was thick with unquestioning loyalty and fervent agreement. Then, the moment arrived. General Gotthard Heinrici was formally given the floor. He was not a naturally charismatic orator like the Führer, but a man of substance, detail, and unwavering integrity, and the meticulous details he was about to reveal constituted a direct, systematic, and professional assault on the very foundation of Operation Barbarossa. With a calmness that belied the storm he was about to unleash, Heinrici began his fateful briefing. He deliberately placed his own detailed maps and intelligent summaries on the large table, right beside the High Command's optimistic charts. He pointed methodically to the glaring discrepancies in the known Soviet order of battle, demonstrating with specific examples how identified and confirmed Red Army divisions already far exceeded the official, dangerously complacent estimates. He cited specific, verifiable radio intercepts that clearly indicated the movement of entire, fresh armies from the deep Soviet interior towards the front. Massive forces that German operational planning had completely failed to account for. Then he addressed the elephant in the room, the T-34 medium tank. He described its revolutionary sloped armor, its wide tracks that offered superior mobility in mud and snow, its powerful 76.2mm gun, all features that combined to make it vastly superior to any main battle tank the German Wehrmacht currently fielded in large numbers. This was not a presentation of mere alternative strategies or cautious opinions. It was a forensic, point-by-point dissection of a fatal strategic miscalculation, delivered with the quiet, undeniable authority of one of Germany's most respected and clear-thinking tactical minds. The initial reaction from Hitler was not one of thoughtful engagement, but of immediate, dismissive contempt. He waved his hand in a brusque, irritated gesture, brushing aside the troubling numbers as if they were irrelevant. "The Russian is primitive, his soul stagnant," he declared, his voice dripping with long-held ideological certainty. "His industry is backward, chaotic. These tanks you speak of are nothing but crude, clumsy imitations of Western designs. Quantity, I tell you, General, is not quality." He then launched into a familiar, rambling monologue about the supreme, unconquerable will of the German soldier. the innate biological inferiority of the Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans, and the corrupting, weakening influence of Bolshevism on the human spirit. Heinrici's empirical facts, grounded in rigorous military science and observation, were crashing with tremendous force against the unyielding, impervious wall of Hitler's racist dogma. In that confined room, it became painfully clear that empirical evidence held no power against deeply held fanatical belief. Seeing his logical, data-driven arguments being completely ignored and dismissed, Heinrici instinctively shifted his approach. He leaned forward over the map table, his voice intensifying, losing its clinical detachment and gaining a raw, urgent edge. He was now appealing not to cold logic, but to a deeper, more primal understanding of warfare, history, and human nature. "Mein Führer," he said, his tone now fierce and pleading. "This is not a war that can be won by willpower and racial purity alone. This is a war of geography, of impossible logistics, of sheer raw endurance. We are meticulously planning for a 100-meter sprint on a prepared track, but what we are actually entering is a brutal, bloody marathon, run through a vast primeval land that has historically devoured entire armies far greater than our own." He returned to his powerful metaphor, now making it even more vivid and threatening. "We are not skilled, patient hunters tracking our prey. We are arrogant fools who have recklessly thrown a heavy stone into a deep, dark bear's cave. We now stand nervously at the entrance, listening intently for a whimper of fear. But what we will soon face is a deafening, earth-shaking roar of pure rage. We have gravely, catastrophically underestimated the sheer size of the beast, the crushing strength of its limbs, and the bottomless, vengeful fury in its heart." The room fell into a stunned, profound silence. The imagery was too powerful, too visceral, too terrifying for anyone to ignore. It was this specific metaphor, the vivid image of Germany, not as a master hunter, but as a mere provocateur, facing an enraged, colossal, and awakened beast, that finally shattered Hitler's carefully maintained composure. The comparison was an intolerable personal insult to his grand vision of Aryan supremacy and inevitable easy conquest. He exploded, his face flushed a deep, blotchy red with pure rage, his voice rising to a shrill, piercing scream that echoed off the concrete walls. He pointed a trembling finger at Heinrici, accusing him of cowardice, of defeatism, of belonging to the reactionary old guard of generals whose minds were trapped in the static warfare of the past. "I will not listen to this poison in my headquarters," he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "Your numbers are lies, your analysis is weak, your spirit is contaminated. The German will is supreme, it is invincible. We kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse into dust. We will be celebrating our victory in Moscow before the first snowfalls." The warning was not merely rejected, it was violently, viciously, and definitively crushed and trampled underfoot. Professional military judgment was declared treason. Objective facts were declared irrelevant in the face of National Socialist faith. Heinrici did not respond. He did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, a rock in a storm of abuse, absorbing the toxic torrent without reaction. The message was unequivocal, the decision final and absolute. The greatest military machine Germany had ever assembled was now irrevocably committed to a course of action that one of its most capable and clear-sighted commanders knew, with every fiber of his being, was fundamentally suicidal. As he walked out of the stifling bunker into the clean air, the bright, warm summer sunlight of June 1941 felt cold and alien on his face. The die was cast in iron. The long, bloody road to Moscow, to Stalingrad, and to ultimate, total ruin was now open wide before them. The warning had been delivered with courage, clarity, and conviction, and it had been utterly, contemptuously ignored. The beast had been savagely provoked, and it was now stirring from its slumber, ready to unleash a fury that would ultimately consume the Third Reich in fire and blood. Dawn on June 22, 1941, broke not with the gentle light of the sun, but with the hellish continuous fire of 10,000 artillery pieces. Operation Barbarossa began with a thunderous, earth-shattering roar that rolled across the entire frontier. The German war machine, a perfectly tuned and seemingly unstoppable instrument of destruction, surged across the Soviet border with overwhelming, brutal force. The Luftwaffe achieved almost total air superiority in the first crucial hours, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft neatly lined up on their airfields, caught by devastating surprise. On the ground, Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups led lightning-fast, deep thrusts that sliced through confused Soviet front lines like a hot knife through butter, creating massive encirclements at Bialystok, Minsk, and later Smolensk. Hundreds of thousands of dazed and disorganized Red Army soldiers were captured in these vast, chaotic pockets. The situation maps in Berlin showed triumphant, sweeping arrows plunging deep into Soviet territory, seemingly validating the Blitzkrieg doctrine. The world watched in a mixture of awe and horror. To all external appearances, Hitler's arrogant prediction was coming true before their eyes. The Soviet colossus appeared to be teetering on the very brink of total and immediate collapse. But for the officers and men actually in the field, the victorious, sanitized narrative was already beginning to fray at the edges, revealing a much darker and more complex reality. General Heinrici, advancing steadily with his infantry corps, noted with professional concern the disturbing details that belied the triumphant headlines from Berlin. Soviet soldiers, even when completely surrounded, outmaneuvered, and critically low on ammunition and food, often refused to surrender, instead fighting to the death with a desperate, ferocious intensity that was both shocking and admirable. They did not behave like a defeated or subhuman force. They fought with a raw, stubborn courage that spoke of a deep resilience. Then came the first, shocking, and unequivocal encounters with the T-34. Veteran German panzer crews, accustomed to easy victories over French and British tanks, watched in disbelief and growing terror as their standard 37mm and even 50mm armor-piercing shells ricocheted harmlessly off the T-34's brilliantly designed sloped armor. The T-34 terror began to spread like a virus through the German ranks, a tangible fear that their technological invincibility was a myth. Heinrici's specific warnings about this very weapon were now materializing on the battlefield with deadly effect. For General Guderian, the initial euphoria of the rapid, seemingly unstoppable advance was quickly replaced by mounting, gnawing frustration. His panzer groups were advancing at a breathtaking pace, covering staggering distances, but they were constantly being halted, delayed, and diverted from their primary objective. The High Command, and Hitler personally, obsessed with the concept of cauldron battles, insisted on wheeling the precious mobile divisions south and north to help the slower-moving infantry close the massive encirclements, rather than allowing them to maintain their focused, decisive drive on Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union. Guderian argued passionately, almost desperately, by radio and in writing, knowing that every day, every hour lost in these side operations was a priceless gift to the Soviets, allowing them precious time to scrape together fresh reserves, fortify their defenses, and bring up those unknown armies from the depths of their country. The pure blitzkrieg was being slowed, diluted, and corrupted, not by Soviet resistance alone, but by German tactical indecision and a fatal obsession with capturing prisoners and territory over securing the ultimate strategic objective. The swift, decisive sprint was already degenerating into a disjointed, exhausting, and costly series of battles. Then, a new and formidable enemy rose against them, one no less deadly than the Red Army, the land itself. The autumn rains arrived in late September, and with them came the legendary Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The primitive, unpaved Russian roads instantly dissolved into bottomless, clinging quagmires of thick, glutinous mud. Trucks, supply wagons, horses, and even the mighty, seemingly invincible panzers sank to their axles and hulls in the impassable sludge. The entire, delicately balanced German supply system, already stretched over hundreds of miles of hostile territory, ground to a catastrophic, complete halt. Fuel, ammunition, food, and winter clothing could not reach the freezing, exhausted frontline troops. The great advance stopped dead, completely and utterly immobilized, not by man, but by nature itself. For the ordinary German soldier, shivering in his summer tunic, covered in mud and plagued by dysentery, The grim reality of their situation became terrifyingly clear. They were stranded in a vast, hostile, and unforgiving country with a savage winter fast approaching. The heady confidence of June gave way to a gnawing, pervasive anxiety. The ghost of Napoleon's 1812 campaign was no longer a distant historical anecdote. It was a shared, unspoken fear in the heart of every soldier, from the lowliest private to the most senior general. When the ground finally froze solid in late November, the German advance lurched forward once more, but it was now a pale, exhausted ghost of its former self. The men were at the end of their physical and mental endurance. Their equipment was worn out and poorly maintained, and crucially, they were still wearing the same thin summer uniforms and leather boots they had started with in June. They pushed forward with a final, desperate effort, reaching the very outermost suburbs of Moscow. Through their field glasses, officers and men alike could see the faint spires of the Kremlin in the distance, glittering in the cold winter sun. The ultimate prize, the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, seemed agonizingly within their grasp, but it was a cruel, taunting illusion. The German army had reached the absolute final limit of its endurance. It was a force operating at the very end of an impossibly long, fragile supply line, its soldiers slowly freezing to death, its machines breaking down from overuse and lack of parts. They stood at the gates of the Soviet capital, but they lacked the last ounce of strength to knock them down. The great kick had been delivered with immense force, but the door, battered and dented, had not fallen. Instead, it was about to be flung open from within, revealing the full, gathered and terrifying fury of the bear they had so recklessly awakened. The cold arrived with a vengeance, a physical entity that seemed to suck the very life from the world. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The German army, still tragically clad in its summer uniforms, began to die en masse, not from Soviet bullets, but from the cold itself. Severe frostbite claimed fingers, toes, hands and feet, filling field hospitals with men destined for amputation and permanent disability. Machine guns and rifles jammed as lubricating oil froze solid. Tank and truck engines had to be lit with blowtorches for hours each morning to have any hope of starting, a dangerous and time-consuming process. Men froze to death silently at their observation posts, their bodies discovered hours later, stiff and icy. The mighty, seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was being systematically crippled and destroyed, not by a human enemy, but by the merciless, impersonal cold of the Russian winter. And then, on December 5, 1941, the second crucial part of Heinrici's prophetic warning materialized with the force of a tactical nuclear strike. From the frozen east, along the Trans-Siberian Railway, poured fresh, fully equipped Soviet divisions into the lines before Moscow. These were not the battered, disorganized conscripts of the summer months. These were the elite, winter-hardened Siberian troops, clad in thick white camouflage smocks and warm, padded felt boots. Their rugged T-34 tanks now painted white for perfect concealment in the snow. This was the bottomless reserve, the hidden strategic depth that Heinrici had tried so desperately to warn the High Command about. The Soviet Union had not run out of armies, it had simply been playing for time, trading space for time, deliberately drawing the overconfident Germans deeper and deeper into the vast interior, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point, and waiting with calculated patience for the precise moment of maximum German vulnerability, the first paralyzing grip of the general winter. The Soviet winter counteroffensive, meticulously prepared by Marshal Zhukov, exploded along the entire Moscow front with stunning ferocity. The exhausted, frozen, psychologically shattered, and hopelessly overextended German lines buckled, broke, and then disintegrated into a chaotic, panicked rout. For the very first time in the Second World War, the Wehrmacht was not just halted, but forced into a full-scale, humiliating retreat. The powerful, carefully cultivated myth of its invincibility was shattered forever, crushed into the icy mud of the Russian plains. The rotten structure had not only held firm against the kick, it had launched a devastating, war-altering blow of its own. General Heinrici was now fighting the battle he had always feared and predicted. As Germany's acknowledged master of defensive warfare, he was urgently ordered to stabilize the collapsing front, to perform tactical miracles with a broken, demoralized and freezing army. He used all his considerable skill and experience, fighting desperate, costly rearguard actions, expertly extracting his decimated units from potential encirclements, and trying frantically to establish a new, stable, defensive line in the deep snow. But he was fighting a losing, two-front war against two relentless enemies. The overwhelming, seemingly endless waves of Soviet infantry and tanks, and the silent, killing embrace of the merciless Russian winter. He watched his once magnificent army, the army he had warned would be led to destruction, disintegrating before his eyes into a ragged, freezing mob. Every painful kilometer of retreat, every burning, abandoned piece of precious equipment, every frozen, contorted corpse by the roadside was a grim, silent, and accusing testament to the chilling accuracy of his unheeded prophecy. The gates of Moscow were now permanently, irrevocably closed to the German army. The dream of a swift, glorious victory was dead, buried in the deep snow along with tens of thousands of German soldiers who would never see their homes again. The war that Hitler had so confidently promised would be over by Christmas had transformed in a matter of weeks into a nightmare of attrition, a brutal, no-quarter struggle for survival that would stretch on for nearly 4 more bloody years. It would be a war fought with unprecedented savagery for every ruined village, every patch of forest, every river crossing across a 1,000-mile front. It would become the most titanic and costly land war in human history, a battle of ideologies and nations that would dwarf all other fronts of the global conflict. The catastrophic failure at the gates of Moscow in December 1941 was the definitive, irreversible turning point of the Second World War. The strategic initiative passed suddenly and decisively from German to Soviet hands, never to return. The long, bloody road of retreat that would ultimately lead to the ruins of Stalingrad, the fiery field of Kursk, and all the way back to the shattered Reich Chancellery in Berlin began at that precise, frozen moment. The beast was not merely awake and defending itself, it was now on the global offensive, filled with a vengeful fury, and it would not stop, would not rest, until it had torn the Third Reich apart, limb from bloody limb. The catastrophic failure of Operation Barbarossa stands as the single most decisive turning point of the Second World War in Europe, and it was a failure conceived and born directly from the willful rejection of a professional, evidence-based warning. By arrogantly dismissing General Heinrici's sober, meticulous assessment in favor of his own racist, ideologically blinded dogma, Adolf Hitler did not merely lose a single military campaign. He irrevocably lost the entire war. The Eastern Front instantly transformed into a vast, bottomless pit, a meat grinder that consumed the overwhelming bulk of Germany's finest manpower, its most advanced tanks, and its combat aircraft for nearly 4 years. The war of racial annihilation that Hitler sought against the Soviet Union became a protracted war of industrial and human attrition, a type of conflict that the resource-rich Soviet Union, increasingly backed by the immense industrial might of the United States, was structurally destined to win. The very core Nazi ideology that blinded Hitler to the Red Army's true strength, resilience, and capacity for sacrifice ultimately ensured his own total, unconditional defeat and the physical destruction of his regime. He had, in his hubris, savagely provoked the Russian bear, and in the end, it was the bear, empowered by a righteous fury, that stormed his capital and devoured his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. General Gotthard Heinrici, the man who saw the disaster coming, survived the war. His reputation as a defensive genius only enhanced by his skilled, if ultimately futile, command during the long, bloody retreats of 1943 and 1944. He became known to his men and to history as the fireman of the Eastern Front, repeatedly dispatched by a desperate high command to shore up the most critically collapsing sectors of the front. In a final, profoundly cruel twist of historical irony, he was given his last command in April 1945 to defend the Zilo Heights, the last natural defensive barrier standing before Berlin itself. The man who had first identified and warned of the burgeoning Soviet juggernaut in the summer of 1941 was now tasked, in the spring of 1945, with stopping that very same, now avenging force at the very gates of the German capital, armed only with a handful of traumatized boys, old men, and depleted, demoralized Volkssturm units. He was the reluctant prophet of doom, destined by fate to personally witness the catastrophic final fulfillment of his own dire prophecy, desperately trying to hold back the very geopolitical and military tide he had seen gathering from the very beginning. The story of the unheeded warning is far more than a compelling historical footnote. It is a timeless, universal lesson in the catastrophic costs of supreme arrogance, unchecked pride, and the deliberate rejection of objective reality in favor of comforting fantasy. It stands as a stark, permanent reminder of how a single, fateful decision, rooted in ideology and personal hubris over reason, empirical analysis, and professional counsel, can irrevocably alter the course of world history and condemn millions of human beings to a terrible, unnecessary fate. In the quiet, factual, responsible briefing of General Heinrici versus the fanatical, spittle-flecked certainty of Adolf Hitler, we see played out the eternal high-stakes conflict between informed professional judgment and willful destructive blindness. The Eastern Front was ultimately won not just by Soviet courage and Allied Lend-Lease, but it was decisively lost in that claustrophobic map room in East Prussia in June 1941. The precise moment a professional soldier's voice was silenced by a dictator's scream, and a dictator's dangerous delusion was allowed to become a death sentence for an entire army, a nation, and his own monstrous regime.